Fernando Alonso's shock podium in Formula One's Bahrain Grand Prix opener came the hard way after fighting his way through the pack. Matters were not made easy for him though, as a shorter DRS zone and Aston Martin's relative lack of straight line speed meant there was no chance of easy passing on the straight. Instead, Alonso had to pull off some great overtaking moves, including a brilliant pass on the inside of Lewis Hamilton with a tricky turn 10. This was possible thanks to Alonso's knowledge of one of the AMR23's great strengths, its braking. This was something made crystal clear when analysing the Q3 qualifying laps of Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc and Alonso himself. Looking at telemetry overlays, the Spaniard was better on the brakes into turns 1, 8, 10 and 11, giving an indication of how well the AMR23 is performing in this area. Aston Martin has clearly overhauled a lot of its car this year, aggressively pursuing the Red Bull-style downwash Aero concept. There's also been a less obviously appreciable difference, specifically the front brake assembly, and it's this that appears to have played a part in Alonso's magic overtakes. The most critical change to Aston Martin's brakes is in abandoning the 3 o'clock caliper mounting position it had in 2022. Instead, it's moved back to the more familiar 6 o'clock position. The caliper itself carries the DNA of its predecessor with a slot along its centre line. This is then divided by a row of ribs that allow the heat rejected by the disc a passage through the caliper's body. A carbon fibre housing is then fixed to the caliper, bringing in cool air via the brake duct inlet and is piped out the rear outlet. The ducting is obviously very different to 2022, given the caliper's position, which has helped the team to introduce other airflow and heat exchanging solutions. The most obvious of these is the inclusion of a disc fairing, which is similar to the ones used by several teams throughout 2022. In Aston Martin's case, the fairing is a little more substantial than last year's solution, though there's been a trend among the teams that already used them in 22 to increase the size of theirs too. This disc fairing is a result of Aston thinking laterally to counteract the changes posed by new regulations that arrived last year. F1's wheel rims increasing from 13 inches to 18 inches resulted in a much larger wheel well, and, whilst the brake disc also grew in diameter up from 278mm to between 325 and 330mm, the volume of free space within the brake drum has increased. Furthermore, the inability to use the brake assembly for aerodynamic throughput has required them to rethink their cooling and aerodynamic strategy. This is even more critical when we consider how teams had, under the previous regulations, employed various tricks to manage heat transfer between the brakes, wheel rim and tyres to further improve performance. The disc fairing has therefore become the first in a nest of enclosures housed within the brake drum as teams look to recover some of the performance. The second layer in the nest, seen here on the right hand side of the image, further assists in routing the airflow and managing the heat transfer between it and the air gap to the main drum surface. Airflow is fed directly into the void and further managed by the strake alongside. Notably, the enclosure on this layer of the nest has a blister surrounding the heat rejection ports around the caliper housing. This not only allows space for the heat to be rejected between the various surfaces, it could also be opened up at future races if the team needs to adjust how the heat moves between the various layers. It wasn't just brakes that were a tech talking point in Bahrain though, there was also a lot of interest around rear wings. In particular, Mercedes had a new lower downforce rear wing version ready for action for Bahrain. The spoon-shaped mainplane design harked back to an idea that Mercedes had previously used from 2015 to 2018. The design allows teams to enjoy both good downforce and low drag. The central deeper portion of the wing produces the extra downforce, while the outer shorter chord portion of the wing blends with the end plate to reduce the drag. The new Mercedes design also bears its underbelly to the oncoming flow, similar to how the central section of a high downforce wing would. Also trying to claw its way back towards Red Bull, Ferrari has been doing some back-to-back comparisons on 2 rear wing setups. The newer option features numerous changes to the main plane, the upper flap and the end plate's tip section. However, the most notable change was a switch from a double mounting pillar arrangement to a single pillar. The single pillar setup was mounted on the car in the early stages of free practice as the team gathered data ahead of its more likely introduction in Saudi Arabia. While television footage from practice showed the wing seemed to flex a lot in the pillar, the team is committed to trialling it again. The design differences between these two specifications of rear wing were all about the trade-offs of one solution over the other. The single pillar is bulkier in order to counter the loads it sustains and uses a crescent-shaped mount that wraps around the exhaust. The single pillar option also meets the DRS pod in a swan neck arrangement, whereas the twin pillars intersect with the underside of the main plane. These changes not only affect how the loads are transferred, but also have aerodynamic consequences too, as the central portion of the wing will see different effects depending on the mount in use. It's still very early in the season, but given the potential for Red Bull dominance, it will be interesting to see the amount of development and convergence of ideas we see over the next months as teams try to fight their way back to the top of the pack.